The concept of Sunnah in the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas, MA thesis, Mcgill University, Montreal, Canada, 1969. The Qur'an stated in various verses, "They asked you concerning the new moons, as to what they should spend, about fighting in the sacred month, about intoxicants and games of chance, concerning the orphans, about menstruation, as to what is allowed them, about the hour when it will come to pass, about war booties, about the soul, about Dhul Qarnayn. They asked thee about mountains," etc. The Qur'an testifies the fact that the impulse and urge of inquiry was so great that it was checked by a special ordinance, so that everything may not become obligatory, and that much of it should be left to the exercise of individual judgment according to the circumstances of the time and place. O you who believe, ask not about things which if made known to you would give you trouble, and if you ask about them then the Qur'an is being revealed. If you ask about them when the Qur'an is being revealed, they will be made known to you. Allah pardons this, and Allah is forgiving and forbearing. D.B. MacDonald said about the following, or the previous verse, "With the coming of Muhammad and the preaching of Islam, this ancestral Sunnah had in great part to yield, but the temper of the Arab mind remained firm, and the Sunnah of Muhammad took its place. Pious Muslims did not say, 'Such was the usage of the fathers, and it is mine,' but 'I follow the usage of the Prophet of God.' Then, just as the old Sunnah of the heathen times had expressed itself through the stories of great warriors, of their battles and loves, through anecdotes of wise men, and their keen and eloquent words, so it was with the Sunnah of one man, Muhammad." 4. We have established above that the Prophet, as a single individual, had introduced sweeping innovations and had practically replaced the pre-Islamic Sunnah based on the idea of collective authorship, forefathers, by his own exemplary conduct, and the believers had practically started to see life from an individual's, i.e. the Prophet's point of view, instead of that of a collective group, i.e. the forefathers. Now here, in this context, it seems reasonable to discuss what was the content and character of the Sunnah of the Prophet. Was it something absolutely specific, laying down once and for all the details of rules about all spheres of human life? Writing on this issue, Dr. Fazlur Rahman points out that the Prophet's biography has certainly no tendency to suggest the impression of the Prophet as a pan-legist, neatly regulating the fine details of human life from administration to those of ritual purity. He continues that the prophetic Sunnah was a general umbrella concept rather than filled with an absolutely specific content, flows directly at a theoretical level from the fact that the Sunnah is a behavioural term. He therefore, after quoting Hasan al-Basri, concludes that the prophetic Sunnah is rather a pointer in a direction rather than an exactly laid out series of rules. Professor Joseph Schatt, summarising the ideals of the Prophet, says, "His aim as a prophet was not to create a new system of law, it was to teach men how to act, what to do and what to avoid in order to pass the reckoning on the day of judgment, and to enter paradise. This is why Islam in general, and the Islamic law in particular, is a system of duties comprising ritual, legal and moral obligations on the same footing, and bringing them all under the authority of the same religious command." To apply religious ethical standards consistently to all aspects of life, according to Professor Schatt, was the original idea of the Prophet. He further maintains that when finally the Prophet had to resort to legislation, the religious and ethical principles were still of his primary concern. But the Prophet eventually had to resign himself to applying religious and ethical principles to the legal institutions as he found them. After quoting different types of legal statements in the Qur'an, he concludes, "They are not meant to lay down legal rules regulating the forms and effects of these transactions, but to establish moral norms under which certain transactions are allowed or forbidden. They are essentially moral and only incidentally penal." It follows from the above discussion of Professor Schatt that the first and last aim of the Prophet was to establish moral norms and to apply religious and ethical principles to all aspects of human behaviour. That is to say, to set an example and to introduce an exemplary conduct so that others follow it. Fazlur Rahman has put it in this way, but the real achievements of Muhammad are to be judged on the basis of what he bequeathed to mankind, both a set of ideals and a concrete way of achieving those ideals. Majid Kaduri calls these religious and ethical principles, a set of divine commands which constituted fundamental law, or constitution for the Islamic concept of Ummah. According to N.J. Coulson, the religious message of the founder prophet of Islam, i.e. the religious and ethical principles of Islam, includes the establishing of certain basic standards of behavior for the Muslim community. He therefore concludes that when the religious message of the prophet was reduced into terms of rights and obligations, and when remedies were provided in the event of infringement, there already existed an accepted standard of conduct. It follows that an accepted standard of conduct was valid and operative from the very beginning of Islam. It will be illuminating to quote the whole passage of Professor Coulson. He writes, "In the evolution of a society, the technical process of legislation is a secondary stage, reducing into terms of rights and obligations an accepted standard of conduct, and providing remedies in the event of this accepted standard. Naturally enough, therefore, the religious message of the founder prophet of Islam, the purpose of which includes the establishment of certain basic standards of behavior in the Muslim community, precedes both in point of time and emphasis his role as a political legislator. Accordingly, the so-called legal matter of the Qur'an consists mainly of broad and general propositions as to what the aims and aspirations of Muslim society should be. It is essentially the bare formulation of the Islamic religious ethic. This accepted standard of conduct and basic standard of behavior, in the terminology of Coulson, was the Sunnah of the Prophet, based on the Qur'anic religious and ethical principles, and this is the view of Shah Wali Allah of Delhi. Discussing the methodology of the early jurists, he says that their primary concern was with those fundamental and basic principles, al-Qawaid al-Kulliyya, which had been neatly enunciated and refined, naqqahaha wa hadhabaha, and whenever they were faced by problems, they sought its solution from these fundamental principles. Further, explaining the term sunnah used by Malik in the Muwatta, Shah Wali Allah says, when Imam Malik uses the word sunnah in the Muwatta, he means the established fundamental principles. These established fundamental principles were actually the religious and ethical principles bequeathed by the Prophet, which were his sunnah during his lifetime and remain so thereafter. Muhammad Iqbal, in his reconstitution of religious thought in Islam, would call these principles the foundational principles which constituted the real message of the Prophet. These foundational principles, says Iqbal, were the exemplar during the lifetime of the Prophet, and they were the groundwork on which the early doctors of law evolved a number of legal systems. Dr. Iqbal clearly has distinguished between the ideals of the Prophet and their application to the habits, ways, and peculiarities of the people to whom he was specifically sent. Therefore, the exemplary conduct and the model behavior of the Prophet means those universal principles which he applied during his life to the specific socio-economic conditions prevalent in Arabia of his time and bequeathed to mankind after his death. Supporting the view of Shah Wali Allah, he sums up his thought in this passage. The Prophet who aims at an all-embracing principle, however, can neither reveal different principles for different peoples, nor leave them to work out their own rules of conduct. His method is to train one particular people and to use them as a nucleus for the building up of a universal Shari'ah. In doing so, he accentuates the principles underlying the social life of all mankind and applies them to concrete cases in light of the specific habit of the people immediately before him. The habit of the people immediately before him. The Sharia rules, ahkam, resulting from this application, i.e. rules relating to penalties for crimes, are in a sense specific to that people, and since their observance is not an end in itself, they cannot be strictly enforced in the case of future generations. Stay tuned for many more parts.